The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, my name is Myra Brower. I'm council staff, and I'm going to be walking you through actions that are being considered in Vision Blueprint Regulatory Amendment 26, which looks at recreational management measures for the snapper grouper fishery. So first of all, why is the council taking action? During a series of stakeholder meetings that took place in 2014, the council set out to gather input from recreational fishermen from throughout the region, and then they prioritized action items that would be addressed through amendments to the snapper grouper FMP over the next 5 years. So this was in response to the Vision Blueprint for that fishery, which was implemented in 2015. So the council chose to focus on seasonality and retention and began development of 2 amendments to address commercial and recreational sectors separately. So this is the amendment that addresses recreational management measures. The council determined that action was needed to increase access and predictability for the recreational component of the snapper grouper fishery. There were also a lot of, we received a lot of input on discards and the need to minimize regulatory discards and also improve regulatory compliance and consistency. So the actions in this amendment consider modifying the recreational aggregates, imposing different bag limits, looking at different size limits or removal of size limits, also gear restrictions and modifications to existing seasons. So there are several proposed actions. I will walk you through each of them. The first action modifies the composition of the recreational aggregates. So what species are actually included in these aggregates. Action 2 then specifies recreational management measures for the deep water species aggregate. So it tiers off of action 1. And now we'll explain to you this a little bit more detail when we get to it. So under action 2, there are then sub-actions that address specific needs for the deep water species aggregate. The first one looks at putting in a recreational season for that group of species. The second one removes some recreational minimum size limits that are still in place for deep water snappers. The third one would specify the bag limit for this group of species. And the fourth one would potentially put in here restriction requirements for deep water species. Action 3 then addresses the shallow water grouper aggregate. And under that action, there are 2 sub-actions. The first one would modify the prohibition for red grouper just off South and North Carolina. The second one would specify the aggregate bag limit for this group of species. Action 4 imposes management measures for the other shallow water species aggregate. And then within that action, there are 2 sub-actions. The first one reduces the recreational minimum size limit for gray triggerfish only off East Florida. And the second one specifies the aggregate bag limit for this group of species. And then finally, there is, in fact, a 5th action that would specify the aggregate bag limit for if the council were to select a snapper grouper species aggregate, which includes all the recreational species for which harvest is allowed. However, this action only becomes relevant if the council chooses alternative 4 under action 1 as their preferred. And I will show you here a picture that will hopefully help you make sense of that. So this is the way that the amendment has been structured. So based on what the council chooses for action 1, with the boxes here in the pink, that will dictate the next series of actions. And so right now the council has chosen alternative 2 as their preferred, which means the way the amendment is structured is with these 4 actions that are here included in this red box. And action 5 is over here by itself because it only comes into play if the council would select alternative 4 as their preferred. So I'm going to be showing you this diagram as we go through to make sure everybody can follow along. So here we go. Action 1 modifies the species composition of the recreational aggregates. So the table you have in your screen is the way that things are grouped right now. We have a 10 snapper aggregate over here in the pink, and those are the species included in that aggregate. There's also a grouper aggregate, which includes all the shallow water groupers. It includes some tile fishes. It includes some deep water groupers and blue line tilefish and golden tilefish. Then there's another aggregate for species that don't have individual bag limits, and that includes the porgies, the jacks, great triggerfish, Atlantic spadefish, and a few others. And then we have a grouping of species that are actually not included in any aggregates. So these are by themselves, and there are separate management measures and bag limits for the species here in this blue column. So this is currently how things are structured. The council is looking at modifying that into form 3 different aggregates: a deep water species aggregate, a shallow water grouper aggregate, and then other shallow water species aggregate. And then within that, they would like to have the option to either include or exclude the species that currently are not in any aggregates. So black sea bass, vermilion snapper, greater amberjack, hogfish, and red porgy could potentially be included in the other shallow water species aggregate. However, the council has not yet selected a preferred between those two sub-alternatives. And so this is how things would be rearranged. So there would be 3 aggregates, one for the deep water species here, the shallow water groupers would be another one, and then one of these 2. So I've put that in blue because there's not been a preferred selected just yet. But so the rest of the amendment is based on 3 aggregates: the deep water species, the shallow water groupers, and the other shallow water species. So under alternative 3, which is not the preferred, there would be 4 different aggregates: one for deep water species, the shallow water grouper aggregate, the shallow water snapper aggregate, and then the other shallow water species aggregate, which again, the council has the option of either including or excluding black sea bass, vermilion, greater amberjack, hogfish, and red porgy. So this is what alternative 3 would look like. There would be 4 aggregates here: the deep water species, the shallow water groupers, the shallow water snappers, and then one of these other 2. And then there's a 4th alternative, which is the one that would be connected to Action 5 that I mentioned earlier. And this is where there would be a snapper grouper aggregate with all the recreational species that are currently allowed to be harvested. And so this would essentially allow the council to sort of cap harvest for all the snapper grouper species for the recreational sector. So we're going to get started then with Action 2. So I've already explained to you the yellow boxes over here. Action 2 deals with just the deep water species. And so there are several sub-actions under that action. So let me walk you through that. So the 4 sub-actions are to specify a recreational season, to remove the minimum size limits, to specify the aggregate bag limits, and to specify year requirements. So the first one, there is currently a recreational season for just some of the species being considered under the deep water species aggregate. So there is a season for blue line tilefish, May through August. There's a season for snowy grouper, also May through August. And there's a season for wreckfish, which is just July and August. And there is no recreational season that's been specified for any of the other species currently in this proposed aggregate. So the council has looked at different sub-alternatives and it's selected sub-alternative 2B as their preferred, which would then put a recreational season of May 1st through August 31st for this group of species, which would include blue line tilefish, snowy grouper, wreckfish, queen snapper, blackfin snapper, silk snapper, misty grouper, yellow edge grouper, and golden tilefish. So the preferred would align the seasonal closure for all deep water species, creating consistency in management for species with similar habitat preferences that are often caught together. So the idea of doing this rearrangement of the aggregates and grouping the species the way the council is proposing is to better reflect how the fishery actually operates. So this would benefit some recreational fishermen, especially those in the for-hire sector who need to schedule trips around seasonal closures. However, this proposed scenario could also decrease access to species that don't currently have seasonal restrictions. Subaction 2.2 would remove the recreational minimum size limit for certain deepwater species. As I mentioned, there are 3 deepwater snappers that still have a 12-inch total length minimum size limit, and the concern there is that minimum size limit for species with high discard mortality are only going to increase the likelihood that the species will not survive being released. And so the idea here is to try to not only make consistent the regulations so that none of the deepwater species have a minimum size limit, but also to try to control regulatory discards. And available data suggests that there's going to be minimal changes in discard or harvest rates because these species are not caught in high numbers recreationally anyway. Subaction 2.3 would specify the bag limit for the deepwater species aggregate. The council has selected a preferred of 3 fish per person per day, keeping the existing restrictions on golden tilefish, snowy grouper, and wreckfish. For golden tilefish right now, recreational anglers can retain 1 per person per day. For snowy grouper, the retention is 1 per vessel per day, and that is also the case for wreckfish. So under these scenarios, the smallest reduction in harvest would be expected under an aggregate bag limit of 3 fish, so subalternatives 2E and the preferred 2F, with very minor differences between the 2. And if you combine the possible recreational season of May through August, removing the minimum size limit for those 3 deepwater snappers and 3 fish per person aggregate with existing restrictions on golden, snowy, and wreckfish, we're looking at possibly a 79% reduction in harvest for the headboat sector, a 51% reduction for charter vessels, and a 21% reduction for the private recreational component. Now, keep in mind that the information that's available for these analyses is very uncertain, particularly for the private and charter components. We have a little bit better information for the headboat sector. Also, species off of South Florida can also be found in state waters, and oftentimes state regulations are not the same as the federal regulations, and but still the landings also count towards annual catch limits. So another thing the council is looking at doing for the deepwater species is, again, to curb discard mortality, is to require a single hook rig when targeting these species. And so currently there are no gear requirements for any of these species. And it is expected that the effects of reducing the number of hooks when targeting these species would be beneficial, assuming that it results in fewer regulatory discards and subsequent mortality for this group of species. However, we don't have information on the prevalence of multi-hook versus single-hook rigs among anglers who fish for this group of species. So it would be a very good, useful information to have if any of you would like to provide information to the council on that. So that takes us through Action 2. And now we're moving on to the shallow water grouper aggregate and the actions under there. So moving on to Action 3. And the first thing there's the 2 sub-actions, as I mentioned earlier. 3.1 modifies the prohibition for red grouper off South Carolina and North Carolina. And 3.2 specifies the aggregate bag limit for this group. So for red grouper, the council's preferred is to extend the seasonal closure only for red grouper, make that January through May, so just extend it for an extra month, and only off North Carolina and South Carolina. So currently, during January through April, no one may fish for or harvest or possess any of the shallow water groupers. So that includes gag, black grouper, red grouper, scamp, red hind, rock hind, yellowmouth grouper, yellowfin grouper, graceby, and coney. So data on recreational landings of red grouper are, however, very limited, especially when you go and separate them by area and then by month. So there is significant uncertainty in the effects analysis of this proposed change. But on average, based on data from 2014 through 2016, any of these proposed sub-alternatives are expected to reduce the recreational landings of red grouper by less than 2%. So none of these proposed alternatives encompass the entirety of the red grouper spawning period, which is, I believe, from May through June with the peak in April. But they would provide a longer time period during which harvest and possession is prohibited, and so that would be beneficial. Okay, and I just covered this slide in what I just presented, so I'm going to move on. Subaction 3.2 would specify the bag limit for this group of species, and here the council has selected a preferred, and that is to make it 3 fish per person per day, where no more than 1 fish can be of any one species in the aggregate. As you can see on your screen, there's several other sub-alternatives. Also, there are sub-alternatives that are specific just for red grouper, 2E and 2F. 2F has a spatial component. It would specify a 1 fish, 1 red grouper per vessel per day for red grouper off the north of the Georgia-Florida state line. So again, looking at information from 2014 through 2016, landings for this group of species averaged about 44,200 fish, whereas the recreational landings of red grouper averaged 11,000 fish. So in relation to harvest over that time period, the projected mean reduction from the preferred subalternative would be for anywhere from 0.3 to 5.4%. So we're talking pretty small change. And then looking just at the red grouper subalternatives, they would result in less than a 1% reduction of red grouper landings for all components of the recreational sector. So that takes us through to action 4, moving on to the other shallow water species aggregate. And the first sub-action there is to reduce the recreational minimum size limit for great triggerfish off East Florida, and then to specify the aggregate bag limit. So for the great triggerfish, the preferred is to reduce the minimum size limit down to 12 inches fork length off of Florida. This is expected to result in an estimated 64.8% increase in recreational great triggerfish landings for all components combined. So that means that the recreational ACL could be met early, possibly by the end of October to mid-November, if the minimum size limit is reduced. So recreational landings of great triggerfish have reached 122%, 88%, and 97% of the recreational ACL in 2014, 2015, and 2016, respectively. And I should mention the ACL for this species is 404,675 pounds. For the specification of the aggregate bag limit, the council has not yet selected a preferred, but you can see the alternative that they're looking at is to specify a 20 fish daily maximum per person for this aggregate. And then they have several sub-alternatives. They could retain 10 snappers within the aggregate, specify no more than 10 can be great triggerfish, specify no more than 10 can be Atlantic spadefish, or specify that no more than 10 can be of any one species. So this alternative in general is expected to result in minimum reduction to recreational landings less than 1% of most of the snapper grouper species, either with or without a reduction in the minimum size limit for great triggerfish. And so here we are at the end. So I'm going to talk then about action 5, which, as I mentioned earlier, is one that would only be considered if the council were to select alternative 4 under action 1 as their preferred, which they haven't, but the action is still there for the public's consideration. And so this action would be to specify the aggregate bag limit for the snapper grouper species aggregate. So here again, the council is looking at specifying a 20 fish daily maximum. So it would cap the harvest at 20 fish, and it would maintain the current restrictions for individual species and maintain the current aggregate limit. So everything would stay the same way that it is now, except there would be a 20 fish daily maximum. And within that alternative, there's sub-alternatives to make some specific changes. Only 10 fish could be great triggerfish, or only 10 fish could be Atlantic spadefish. So under this alternative, it is expected that the reduction in recreational landings for all components combined would be anywhere from 0.3 to 0.34%. So again, a very minimal change. So we are taking public comment on this amendment. The council is going to be reviewing those comments at their June meeting. So folks may submit the comments using our online form, which is available on our website from the public hearings and scoping meetings page. Those comments are immediately posted and council members and the public can view them. Written comments have to be received in the council office by the 11th of May. You can mail them at the address on your screen, or you can fax them in. You can also access other materials for the public hearings. There is a public hearing summary, a copy of this presentation, and the draft amendment, which contains more detailed analyses for you to look through. Thank you for listening.